My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, racing through red lights toward Methodist General Hospital. The call had come at 7:30 that evening while I was preparing dinner in my quiet kitchen. Crystal's voice shaking with what I thought was genuine terror, telling me my only son Bradley was fighting for his life after a horrific car accident. Racing through those sterile corridors, my heart hammering against my ribs, a young nurse named Sarah suddenly grabbed my arm. "Hide and trust me," she whispered urgently, pulling me into an empty supply room. Through the crack in the door, I watched my daughter-in-law Crystal speaking calmly to a doctor, her voice cold as winter steel. "Good, the accident worked perfectly. When can we declare him brain dead?" My knees buckled as the words hit me like a physical blow. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as I pressed my back against the supply room wall, Sarah's gentle hand on my shoulder the only thing keeping me upright. My mind raced backward through 3 years of what I now realized had been an elaborate deception, starting with that autumn day when Bradley first brought Crystal home to our family dinner table. I should have trusted my instincts then. Bradley had always been careful with relationships, taking his time to really know someone before making commitments. But Crystal had swept into his life like a hurricane during his vulnerable period after his father's death. She was working as a dental hygienist at his dentist's office, all bright smiles and flowing auburn hair, claiming she'd grown up in foster care with no family of her own. The red flags had been there from the beginning. Crystal would interrupt Bradley mid-sentence, finish his thoughts for him, and answer questions I'd directed to my son. When I gently suggested they slow down their engagement after only 4 months of dating, Crystal burst into tears at my kitchen table, sobbing about how she'd never had a real family and thought I might finally accept her as a daughter. Bradley had rushed to comfort her, shooting me a look that cut straight through my heart. "Mom, Crystal needs our support, not judgment. Dad would have welcomed her with open arms." Those words stung because Robert would have indeed been more accepting, but Robert also would have seen through her manipulation much sooner than I had. Crystal's expensive tastes became apparent immediately. She convinced Bradley they needed a bigger apartment, then a house, then a luxury car to match their image. When Bradley confided that his inheritance from Robert wasn't enough for the down payment on their dream house in Maple Grove, I made the painful decision to sell Robert's vintage car collection. Those 19 classic cars had been Robert's pride and joy, accumulated over 30 years of careful searching and restoration. The 1967 Mustang Fastback, the 1971 Plymouth Barracuda, the 1969 Camaro SS that he'd driven on our first date. Each vehicle held precious memories of weekend trips to car shows, evenings in the garage, talking about everything and nothing while he worked on engines, teaching Bradley to appreciate American craftsmanship. I sold every single one for $420,000, watching strangers drive away with pieces of my late husband's soul. Crystal cried grateful tears when I presented the check, throwing her arms around me and calling me the mother she'd never had. But I noticed she didn't protest when I mentioned selling the cars didn't suggest they find a smaller house or wait until Bradley's accounting practice grew more profitable. After their wedding, Crystal began systematically isolating Bradley from our family traditions. Sunday dinners at my house became monthly, then holiday-only affairs. She claimed the drive from their new subdivision was too stressful for her sensitive stomach. When Bradley called to cancel our regular Tuesday evening dinners, he always sounded tired, apologetic, explaining that Crystal needed him home because she was having anxiety attacks about starting a family. Over the past 6 months, Bradley's appearance had changed dramatically. My robust, confident son had become gaunt and pale, losing at least 25 pounds from his already lean frame. His thick brown hair looked dull and lifeless, and dark circles shadowed his green eyes. When I expressed concern, Crystal quickly explained that Bradley was working incredibly long hours at his accounting firm, trying to make the partner before age 35. "You know how driven he is, just like his father," Crystal would say sweetly. "I keep telling him to slow down, but he wants to provide the best life possible for our future family." She'd rest her manicured hand on her flat stomach meaningfully, though they'd been trying to conceive for over a year without success. The morning of the accident replayed in my mind with crystal clarity now. Crystal had called at 10:15, her voice breaking with what I'd believed was raw grief. "Evangeline, something terrible has happened. Bradley was driving to surprise me with dinner reservations for our anniversary when his car went off the road on Highway 42. They've taken him to Methodist General. I'm too hysterical to drive. Can you meet me there?" I'd dropped everything, grabbing my purse and keys without even turning off the stove. During the 20-minute drive to the hospital, I'd prayed desperately that my son would survive, that the doctors could repair whatever damage had been done, that our recently strained relationship wouldn't end with words left unspoken. Now, listening to Crystal's cold conversation through the supply room door, I realized that every prayer I'd whispered during that frantic drive had been necessary for entirely different reasons than I'd imagined. My son wasn't the victim of a tragic accident. He was the target of a calculated murder plot orchestrated by the woman he trusted most in the world. Sarah squeezed my hand as Crystal's voice drifted through the partially open door again. "I need to know exactly how long the process takes. Are we talking hours or days before the paperwork can be finalized?" Dr. Martinez's response made my blood freeze in my veins. "Typically, we observe for 24 to 48 hours before declaring brain death, but given the severity of the trauma and the patient's current neurological status, we could potentially expedite the process if family requests immediate organ donation." "Oh, Bradley would want that," Crystal replied quickly. "He always said he wanted to help others if anything happened to him. I think we should proceed as quickly as possible. Keeping him on life support when there's no hope seems cruel." The supply room suddenly felt airless. Sarah noticed my shallow breathing and guided me to a small chair beside shelves stocked with medical supplies. Through my shock, I registered that this young woman with kind blue eyes and prematurely silver hair had risked her job to warn me about something that could have resulted in my son's death. "How did you know?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Sarah's expression hardened with determination. "I overheard your daughter-in-law making phone calls yesterday afternoon. She was sitting in the family consultation room talking to someone about how tomorrow changes everything." When she noticed me nearby, she quickly hung up, but I saw her researching brain death procedures on the computer terminal afterward. The final piece of Part 2's revelation hit me like a sledgehammer. This hadn't been a spontaneous decision made in grief. Crystal had been planning Bradley's murder with methodical precision, researching the exact procedures needed to convince doctors that my son was beyond saving. As Crystal's footsteps echoed down the hallway, Sarah turned to me with urgent intensity. "Mrs. Patterson, we need to find out exactly what your daughter-in-law is planning, because I don't think this accident was accidental at all." Sarah cracked the supply room door open wider, allowing us to hear Crystal's continuing conversation with Dr. Martinez as they walked slowly down the corridor. My heart sank as I realized how thoroughly Crystal had prepared for this moment, having researched every aspect of the medical and legal processes that would allow her to claim Bradley's life insurance policy. I brought all of Bradley's important paperwork with me. Crystal was saying, her voice steady despite the tears I could see glistening on her cheeks as they passed our hiding spot. "His life insurance policy, medical directives, everything we updated just 6 months ago when we decided to start trying for a family." Dr. Martinez's voice carried professional sympathy. That was very thoughtful planning on your part, Mrs. Patterson. Many families struggle to locate important documents during crisis situations. The casual mention of Bradley's life insurance policy sent ice through my veins. 6 months ago, when Crystal claimed they were preparing for parenthood, Bradley had mentioned updating some paperwork, but hadn't provided specific details. I'd assumed they were establishing wills or setting up college savings accounts for future children. Bradley was so responsible about protecting our future. Crystal continued dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. He insisted on increasing the life insurance coverage from $500,000 to $2 million. He said if anything happened to him, he wanted to make sure I'd never have to worry about money while raising our children alone. $2 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. Robert's life insurance policy had been $150,000, which I'd considered generous for a man who worked as a high school principal. What possible reason would Bradley have for carrying insurance worth more than most people's houses? Through my growing horror, I remembered Crystal's pregnancy scare last December. She'd been convinced she was expecting, dragging Bradley to multiple doctor appointments, shopping for baby furniture, making elaborate plans for nursery decorations. When the pregnancy test came back negative after 3 weeks of false alarms, she'd been devastated for days, claiming she'd already begun feeling maternal instincts. Now I realized that entire episode had been orchestrated to convince Bradley that they needed higher life insurance coverage. Crystal had probably convinced him that starting a family required more financial protection, playing on his deep-seated fear of leaving a child fatherless the way he'd been devastated by Robert's sudden heart attack. Dr. Martinez's voice grew more clinical as they discussed timeline details. The neurological tests we've conducted show severe trauma to multiple brain regions. Given the extent of the damage, it's unlikely your husband will regain consciousness. However, we'll continue monitoring for any changes in his condition over the next 24 hours before making final determinations. Doctor, I appreciate your caution, but I need to be realistic about this situation. Crystal replied, her tone shifting to one of resigned bravery. Bradley wouldn't want to exist in a vegetative state. He's always been very clear about his wishes regarding life support. If there's truly no hope for recovery, I think we should consider organ donation as soon as medically appropriate. The calculated nature of her response made my stomach lurch. She was systematically manipulating a caring physician into expediting the process that would allow her to collect Bradley's life insurance money and disappear before anyone could investigate the circumstances of his accident. My mind raced back to the past several weeks, remembering how exhausted Bradley had seemed during our last few phone conversations. He'd complained about having trouble sleeping, feeling dizzy during the day, experiencing persistent headaches that he attributed to stress at work. Crystal had been so attentive during those calls, bringing him herbal tea and suggesting he might need stronger sleep medication from his doctor. Sarah leaned closer to whisper in my ear. Mrs. Patterson, I need to tell you something else. Yesterday afternoon, after I overheard your daughter-in-law's phone conversation, I checked the security footage from the parking garage. She was out there for almost 30 minutes before visiting hours started, and she had some kind of toolkit with her. The implication hit me immediately. Crystal hadn't been inside the hospital grieving when Bradley's accident occurred. She'd been in the parking garage potentially tampering with his vehicle before he left work. The toolkit Sarah mentioned could have contained anything needed to sabotage brake lines, steering mechanisms, or other critical car components. Crystal's phone rang, interrupting her conversation with Dr. Martinez. Excuse me, doctor, I should take this. It might be Bradley's office calling about the accident. But as Crystal stepped into an empty patient room for privacy, I could hear her voice transform completely. Gone was the grief-stricken widow's tremulous tone, replaced by warm affection and intimate familiarity. "Derek, honey, everything's going according to plan. The doctor thinks we're looking at 24 to 48 hours maximum before I can authorize organ donation. The insurance investigator shouldn't have any reason to delay payment once I provide the death certificate and accident report. Derek." My mind scrambled to place that name, but I'd never heard Crystal mention anyone called Derek during family gatherings or casual conversations. This was clearly someone important in her life, someone who knew intimate details about her plans for Bradley's death. "I miss you too, baby." Crystal continued, her voice dropping to a lover's whisper. "Just 2 more days, and we'll be on that flight to Costa Rica. The beach house rental is confirmed for 6 months, and I've already transferred half the money to the offshore account like you suggested." Costa Rica. Offshore accounts. The scope of Crystal's deception was far more elaborate than simple insurance fraud. She'd been planning to flee the country with a secret boyfriend, using Bradley's death as financing for their new life together. "Don't worry about the old lady," Crystal said, referring to me with casual contempt. "Bradley's mother never liked me anyway, so she won't ask too many questions about the accident. She'll probably be relieved that her precious son is finally free from his manipulative wife." The cruelty of that statement cut through me like a blade. Crystal had recognized my protective instincts regarding Bradley, but she'd interpreted my legitimate concerns as petty jealousy rather than maternal wisdom sensing danger. When Crystal returned to continue her conversation with Dr. Martinez, her grieving widow performance resumed flawlessly. "I'm sorry about that interruption, doctor. Bradley's insurance company needed some preliminary information about the accident. They were very sympathetic and assured me that processing the claim should be straightforward once we have official documentation." But then Crystal made a mistake that revealed the true depths of her planning. "Doctor, I should mention that Bradley has been struggling with depression lately. I found this note in his desk drawer this morning while looking for our insurance information." She produced a folded piece of paper with Bradley's distinctive handwriting, but something about it looked wrong, even from my position 20 feet away. The letter formation seemed too careful, too deliberate, lacking the natural flow of Bradley's usual quick scrawl. "I can't bear the thought that my husband might have intentionally caused this accident," Crystal said, fresh tears streaming down her face. "But I think you should be aware that he'd been having very dark thoughts about feeling like a failure, about not being able to provide the life he'd promised me." The suicide note was obviously forged, but Crystal had done her homework well enough to make it plausible to medical professionals who didn't know Bradley's character. My son had never struggled with depression, had never expressed suicidal thoughts, and had always been optimistic about building his future with the woman he loved. Dr. Martinez examined the note with professional concern. "Mrs. Patterson, this information is very helpful for understanding your husband's state of mind before the accident. I'll make sure our psychiatrist evaluates this as part of the overall assessment." As they walked away from our hiding spot, I realized that Crystal had constructed a complete narrative designed to prevent any investigation into Bradley's death. The forged suicide note would discourage police from examining his car for signs of tampering. The increased life insurance policy would provide apparent motive for the depression, and her immediate authorization of organ donation would ensure that any toxicology evidence would be compromised. Sarah's hand found mine in the darkness of the supply room. "Mrs. Patterson, your daughter-in-law has been planning this for months. We need to see your son immediately and figure out exactly what she's done to him." The weight of Sarah's words settled over me like a shroud. This wasn't just attempted murder. It was the culmination of an elaborate long-term scheme that had begun the moment Crystal decided Bradley was worth more to her dead than alive. Sarah led me through a maze of service corridors using her badge to access restricted elevator systems that allowed us to reach the intensive care unit without encountering Crystal in the main hallways. The antiseptic smell of the hospital seemed more oppressive with each step, knowing that my son lay unconscious somewhere ahead, victim of the woman who'd sworn to love and protect him. The ICU buzzed with quiet activity as machines beeped and hummed, monitoring patients whose lives hung in precarious balance. Sarah guided me past several rooms before stopping at a door marked with Bradley's name and medical chart. Through the glass partition, I saw my son for the first time since the accident, and the sight nearly brought me to my knees. Bradley lay motionless on the narrow hospital bed, his face pale and drawn beneath the oxygen mask covering his nose and mouth. Tubes and wires connected his body to machines that monitored every heartbeat, every breath, every neurological response. His thick brown hair was matted with dried blood from head injuries, and purple bruises covered his visible skin like a roadmap of violence. But it was his hands that broke my heart completely. Bradley's hands had always been his most expressive feature, constantly in motion when he talked gentle, when he comforted others strong, when he worked on mechanical projects with his father. Now those beloved hands lay limp and motionless IV lines threading through bruised veins that had once carried the blood of health and vitality. The injuries are consistent with brake failure, Sarah explained softly, checking the hallway to ensure we remained unobserved. When the emergency team brought him in, they mentioned that his car went off the road at nearly 60 miles per hour, with no signs of skid marks or attempts to slow down. No skid marks. That detail confirmed my worst fears about Crystal's involvement in the accident. Bradley was an cautious driver, someone who maintained his vehicles meticulously and always kept emergency supplies in his trunk. Under normal circumstances, he would have sensed brake problems and taken corrective action long before losing complete control of his car. While Sarah monitored the hallway for Crystal's potential return, I searched through Bradley's personal belongings that had been collected from the accident scene. His wallet, keys, and phone had been placed in a clear plastic bag on the bedside table, along with the clothes that had been cut away by emergency medical personnel. Hidden beneath Bradley's spare change and business cards, I found a small flip phone that I'd never seen before. It wasn't the iPhone that Bradley always carried, and the cheap plastic casing suggested it was a disposable burner phone purchased for temporary use. My hands trembled as I powered it on, praying it would provide answers while dreading what those answers might reveal. The phone's message history made my blood run cold. Dozens of text conversations between Crystal and someone named Derek spanning back 4 months to early autumn. The earliest messages showed Crystal complaining about Bradley's boring personality and pathetic salary, expressing frustration that he wasn't advancing professionally as quickly as she'd expected. But as the weeks progressed, the conversations became increasingly sinister. Derek encouraged Crystal to take control of the situation and stop waiting for things to improve naturally. By mid-October, they were discussing specific methods for accessing Bradley's insurance policies and bank accounts without arousing suspicion. November's messages revealed the true scope of their conspiracy. Crystal had been systematically researching Bradley's daily routines, documenting his work schedule, mapping his regular driving routes, and identifying the most isolated stretch of highway where an accident could occur without witnesses. "Baby, I've been watching him for 3 weeks now." One message read, "He always takes Highway 42 home from the office, and there's a perfect curve near mile marker 18 where the guardrails are damaged from that storm last month. If his brakes failed there, it would look completely natural." Derek's responses were equally chilling. "I've been researching brake line cutting techniques online. It needs to look like normal wear and tear, not sabotage. The anti-freeze method takes longer, but it's basically undetectable if we're patient enough. Anti-freeze. The word made my stomach lurch as I remembered Bradley's recent health complaints. Anti-freeze poisoning caused exactly the symptoms Bradley had been experiencing: fatigue, dizziness, headaches, and nausea. Crystal had been slowly killing my son while simultaneously planning the car accident that would finish the job. I scrolled deeper into the message history, discovering that Crystal had been conducting surveillance on Bradley for months. She knew his schedule better than he did, tracking his movements with the precision of a professional stalker. Messages detailed which restaurants he favored for lunch, which gas stations he used, which routes he took to avoid traffic during rush hour. More disturbing were the messages showing Crystal's research into insurance investigation procedures. She'd spent weeks learning how quickly life insurance claims were processed, what documentation was required, and how to avoid triggering fraud investigations. She'd even contacted multiple insurance agents pretending to shop for coverage while actually learning about potential red flags that might delay payment. The phone contained photo evidence that made my hands shake with rage. Pictures of Bradley's car taken from various angles showing the brake lines and other mechanical components that Crystal had been studying. Timestamps indicated the photos had been taken over several weeks, suggesting she'd been accessing his vehicle regularly while he worked. But the most damaging evidence came from Crystal's banking records, which she'd photographed and sent to Derek for review. She'd opened multiple secret accounts using fake identification, established overseas wire transfer capabilities, and researched countries with non-extradition treaties that would allow them to disappear permanently. Real estate documents showed that Crystal had already contacted a realtor about selling the house she and Bradley shared, claiming they were planning to relocate for his job. Travel confirmations revealed round-trip tickets to Costa Rica scheduled for the following week, with return dates left intentionally open. As I absorbed the scope of Crystal's betrayal, Sarah quietly entered the room carrying a manila folder thick with medical documentation. Her expression was grim as she spread the papers across Bradley's bedside table, pointing to laboratory results that confirmed my worst suspicions. "I pulled your son's blood work from when he was admitted," she explained. The toxicology screen shows elevated levels of ethylene glycol, which is the primary component in automotive antifreeze. The levels aren't immediately lethal, but they indicate chronic exposure over several weeks. Chronic exposure. Crystal had been poisoning Bradley, slowly weakening his system while planning the accident that would kill him. The medical evidence proved that my son had been suffering from intentional poisoning disguised as work-related stress and fatigue. "There's more." Sarah continued, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "I accessed the hospital's computer system and found that your daughter-in-law has been consulting with multiple doctors about brain death procedures. She's been asking very specific questions about organ donation timelines and legal requirements for authorizing life support termination." The scope of Crystal's preparation was breathtaking in its thoroughness. She'd researched every aspect of her husband's murder, from the initial poisoning through the final insurance claim processing. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was a calculated business transaction that happened to involve ending a human life. In Bradley's wallet, I found additional evidence of Crystal's deception. Bank statements showed unusual withdrawal patterns over the past 6 months, with large amounts of cash being removed from accounts that Bradley rarely accessed. Credit card receipts revealed purchases at hardware stores, automotive supply shops, and medical supply companies that Bradley would never have made personally. Most damning was a handwritten note in Crystal's distinctive cursive script, hidden behind Bradley's driver's license. The note contained a detailed timeline for the week of the accident, including specific times for car preparation, alibi establishment, and hospital notification procedures. Sarah discovered the final piece of evidence hidden inside Bradley's phone case. Crystal had been using medical power of attorney forms from multiple different law offices, apparently forging Bradley's signature on documents that would give her authority to make life and death medical decisions without oversight or challenge from other family members. "Mrs. Patterson," Sarah said urgently, "your daughter-in-law has been setting up a system that would allow her to authorize brain death declaration and organ donation tonight during the skeleton crew shift when there's less supervision and oversight." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Crystal wasn't planning to wait the standard 24 to 48 hours that Dr. Martinez had mentioned. She intended to use forged medical power of attorney documents to convince the night shift staff that Bradley had expressly wished for immediate organ donation in the event of brain death. As I stood beside my unconscious son's hospital bed, surrounded by evidence of the most elaborate betrayal, I could have imagined one final detail caught my attention. Hidden in a pocket of Bradley's work jacket was a small digital recording device, the kind used for dictating business memos or recording important meetings. With trembling fingers, I activated the device and heard my son's voice recorded just 3 days before his accident. The message was addressed to me, expressing concerns about Crystal's strange behavior, her secretive phone calls, and his growing suspicion that she was hiding something important about their relationship. "Mom, if something happens to me, I need you to know that I've been having doubts about Crystal for weeks now. She's been acting strange, asking weird questions about insurance policies and medical procedures. I found some phone numbers in her purse that she couldn't explain, and I'm starting to think she's been lying about a lot of things. I don't know what she's planning, but I wanted you to hear this message in case I don't get a chance to tell you in person." Bradley's recorded voice broke with emotion as he continued. "I know you never fully trusted her, and I'm sorry I didn't listen to your concerns earlier. You were right about her all along, Mom. I just hope I figure out what she's really up to before it's too late." The recording ended with my son's promise to confront Crystal about his suspicions after their anniversary dinner, the same dinner that had provided the perfect cover for his attempted murder. Bradley had discovered Crystal's deception just days before she implemented her final plan, but he'd run out of time to protect himself from the woman who'd been slowly poisoning him for months. As I held that small recording device listening to my son's voice predicting his own murder, I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. The grief and shock that had overwhelmed me for the past several hours crystallized into cold, focused determination. Crystal had made one critical mistake in her elaborate plan. She'd assumed that I would be too devastated by Bradley's apparent accident to investigate the circumstances surrounding his death. She'd underestimated the protective instincts of a mother who'd already lost her husband and refused to lose her son without a fight. Sarah squeezed my shoulder as I wiped away the last tears I would shed until this nightmare was over. "Mrs. Patterson, what do you want to do with all this evidence?" I looked down at my son's bruised and battered face, thinking about the strong, loving man who'd trusted the wrong woman with his life and his future. "We're going to save Bradley's life," I said quietly, "and we're going to make sure Crystal pays for every single thing she's done to him." Standing beside Bradley's hospital bed, surrounded by overwhelming evidence of Crystal's systematic betrayal, I felt the last vestiges of shock and grief transform into something far more powerful, cold, calculating determination. The tears stopped flowing, my hands stopped shaking, and my mind began working with a clarity I hadn't experienced since Robert's death 3 years earlier. Sarah watched this transformation with evident relief, recognizing that grief had given way to strategic thinking. "Mrs. Patterson, we need to move quickly. Your daughter-in-law could return at any moment, and she's planning to implement the final phase of her plan tonight. I nodded, my voice steady for the first time since receiving Crystal's phone call hours earlier. Then we need to gather evidence that will stand up in court and ensure that Bradley survives long enough to testify against her. What's our first priority? Sarah's expression became grimly professional. Documentation. We need to preserve everything you found in a way that maintains the legal chain of evidence. I have contacts in hospital security who can help us, but we need to be systematic about this. Using Crystal's burner phone, I carefully photographed every text message conversation between her and Derek, making sure to capture timestamps and send her information clearly. The messages revealed a conspiracy far more elaborate than simple insurance fraud, involving money laundering, identity theft, and what appeared to be connections to other suspicious deaths. One conversation from 3 weeks earlier made my blood freeze. Derek, I've been thinking about our conversation with Jimmy and Rick last month. If this works as well as it did with Crystal's first husband in Phoenix, we might have a real business opportunity here. Rich, lonely men are everywhere, and life insurance policies are getting easier to access. Crystal's first husband. This wasn't her debut as a Black Widow. It was the latest in a series of calculated murders designed to fund a lifestyle she felt entitled to. The casual mention of Jimmy and Rick suggested a network of accomplices who'd helped her kill before and would likely help her disappear after collecting Bradley's insurance money. I scrolled through more messages, finding references to other projects in different states. Crystal and her associates had apparently been operating a sophisticated marriage fraud scheme, targeting financially stable men who could be isolated from their support systems and systematically murdered for insurance payouts. Sarah returned with a security guard named Pete, a heavy-set man with kind eyes who'd worked at Methodist General for over 15 years. Mrs. Patterson, Sarah's filled me in on the situation. I've been watching your daughter-in-law since yesterday, and her behavior has been raising red flags for several staff members. Pete pulled out a tablet containing security footage from the hospital's parking garage. This is from yesterday afternoon around 3 p.m. Watch your daughter-in-law's activities while she was supposedly visiting your son. The footage showed Crystal entering the parking garage with a small toolbox, locating Bradley's sedan, and spending nearly 40 minutes working underneath the vehicle. She moved with confidence and precision, clearly familiar with automotive systems and brake line locations. When she finished, she carefully cleaned her tools and disposed of what appeared to be pieces of brake line tubing in a dumpster behind the hospital. She knew exactly what she was doing, Pete explained. This wasn't amateur sabotage. Someone taught her how to cut brake lines in a way that would cause failure after a specific amount of driving time. The security footage provided irrefutable proof of Crystal's direct involvement in Bradley's accident, but we needed more evidence to expose the full scope of her conspiracy. I used the burner phone to access Crystal's recent call history, discovering that she'd been in contact with Derek multiple times throughout the day of Bradley's accident. Working with military precision, I began texting Derek from Crystal's phone, pretending to be her while gathering additional incriminating information. Baby, the old lady showed up at the hospital earlier than expected. Do you think she suspects anything about our timeline? Derek's response arrived within minutes, revealing crucial details about their escape plan. Don't worry about her. Once the brain death paperwork is signed tonight, we'll be on the morning flight to Miami. The Costa Rica connection leaves at 2 p.m. and we'll be drinking cocktails on the beach by sunset. The offshore account transfer is already set up for automatic processing once you submit the death certificate. I continued the deception, texting Derek again. I'm getting nervous about the brake line job. What if the accident investigation team notices something suspicious? Derek's reply exposed even more of their criminal network. Jimmy already talked to his buddy at the police impound lot. For $5,000 cash, the evidence will disappear before any investigation happens. We've done this before, Crystal. Trust the system we've built. The casual mention of police corruption added another layer of complexity to Crystal's scheme. They'd apparently bribed law enforcement officials to cover up evidence of previous murders, suggesting a criminal operation with tentacles reaching far beyond simple insurance fraud. Sarah had been quietly coordinating with her supervisor to document the medical evidence of Bradley's poisoning. Mrs. Patterson, I've been reviewing your son's recent medical history, and there are clear signs that he'd been seeking treatment for symptoms consistent with antifreeze poisoning over the past 6 weeks. She showed me emergency room records from a month earlier when Bradley had sought treatment for severe nausea and dizziness that he'd attributed to food poisoning. The attending physician had noted unusual neurological symptoms that suggested toxic exposure, but Bradley had declined follow-up testing when Crystal convinced him that stress from work was the likely cause. Your daughter-in-law has been controlling your son's medical care, Sarah continued. She accompanied him to every appointment, answered questions for him, and consistently steered doctors away from toxicology testing that would have revealed the poisoning. The pattern of medical manipulation added another dimension to Crystal's systematic abuse of Bradley. She'd been not only poisoning him, but also preventing him from receiving proper medical care that might have saved his life weeks earlier. Pete returned with additional security footage from the hospital's main entrance showing Crystal's activities throughout the day. Mrs. Patterson, your daughter-in-law, has been making phone calls in the parking lot every 30 to 40 minutes. She's clearly coordinating with someone about timing and logistics. Through the car window visible in the footage, I could see Crystal consulting written notes while speaking on her phone. Her body language was confident and businesslike, showing none of the emotional distress that had characterized her performance for medical staff and family members. My brother-in-law Marcus arrived at the hospital after Sarah contacted him using the emergency number I'd provided. Marcus had retired from the police force 5 years earlier, but his decades of experience investigating insurance fraud and domestic violence cases made him invaluable for understanding the legal aspects of Crystal's crimes. Evangeline, this is far more sophisticated than typical domestic murder cases, Marcus explained after reviewing the evidence we'd gathered. The poisoning, mechanical sabotage, forged documents, and planned flight from the country suggest a criminal organization rather than a desperate individual acting alone. Marcus used his law enforcement contacts to run background checks on Derek and the other names mentioned in Crystal's text messages. The results were terrifying. Derek had arrest records in 3 states for insurance fraud, identity theft, and suspected involvement in 2 other suspicious spouse deaths that had never been prosecuted due to insufficient evidence. The good news, Marcus continued, is that we have enough evidence to prevent Crystal from completing her plan tonight. The bad news is that we need to catch her in the act of attempting to forge medical documents or authorize unnecessary procedures. Otherwise, a skilled defense attorney might argue that all this evidence was circumstantial. Sarah discovered that Crystal had been bribing Linda, the night shift supervisor, to expedite brain death declaration procedures without proper oversight. Linda has gambling debts that Crystal somehow discovered and has been exploiting. For $10,000, Linda agreed to process organ donation paperwork without following standard verification protocols. The corruption extended deeper into the hospital system than any of us had initially suspected. Crystal had spent months identifying vulnerable staff members who could be bribed or manipulated into circumventing safety procedures designed to prevent exactly this type of medical fraud. As the evening shift change approached, I realized that Crystal was preparing to implement her final plan within hours. The forged power of attorney documents would allow her to authorize organ donation. The bribed supervisor would rush the paperwork through without proper review, and the corrupted police investigator would ensure that evidence of the car sabotage disappeared before forensic examination could occur. But Crystal had made one crucial error in her elaborate scheme. She'd assumed that I would remain in shock and grief, trusting medical professionals and legal procedures without question. She'd failed to anticipate that a mother's protective instincts combined with mounting evidence of betrayal would transform me into an adversary capable of exposing her entire operation. Using Crystal's burner phone one final time, I sent Derek a message that would serve as the trap that brought down their entire network. Change of plans, baby. The old lady is asking too many questions, and I think she might know more than she's letting on. We need to accelerate everything and get out of here tonight. Meet me at the hospital at midnight and bring the emergency documents we discussed. Derek's response confirmed that our trap was working. Are you sure she's a threat? We've put too much work into this setup to abandon it now. Maybe we should just eliminate the problem permanently before finishing the job. That final message provided evidence of conspiracy to commit murder against me, personally giving law enforcement additional charges that would ensure Crystal and her accomplices faced maximum prison sentences. More importantly, it proved that they planned to kill anyone who threatened their operation, making their crimes far more serious than simple insurance fraud. As midnight approached, I positioned myself where I could observe Crystal's interactions with Derek, while remaining hidden from their view. Sarah and Pete coordinated with hospital security to document everything, while Marcus worked with his police contacts to ensure that trained officers would be present to arrest the entire conspiracy network. For the first time since receiving Crystal's phone call that afternoon, I felt confident that Bradley would survive this nightmare, and that justice would be served against the woman who'd betrayed his love in the most devastating way imaginable. Crystal was about to discover that the grieving mother she'd dismissed as harmless was actually the most dangerous threat her criminal organization had ever encountered. The clock on the intensive care unit wall showed 11:45 p.m. as I made my way through the dimly lit corridors, my heart hammering with nervous energy despite the calm expression I'd practiced maintaining. Crystal would be arriving soon for her midnight meeting with Derek, but first I needed to execute the most challenging performance of my life, convincing her that I remained the naive, grieving mother she expected me to be. I found Crystal in the family consultation room, hunched over her laptop computer, with several manila folders spread across the small table. She looked up as I entered, immediately transforming her face into a mask of profound grief and exhaustion. "Oh, Evangeline," she whispered, rising to embrace me with what appeared to be desperate relief. "I'm so glad you're here. I've been trying to handle all the paperwork alone, but it's overwhelming. I keep thinking about how Bradley would want me to handle everything, and I just don't know if I'm making the right decisions." The performance was masterful, complete with trembling hands and tears that seemed genuine to anyone who hadn't overheard her cold-blooded conversations with Derek and the medical staff. I forced myself to return her embrace, fighting every instinct that screamed at me to confront her immediately about her crimes. "Crystal, sweetheart, you don't have to carry this burden alone," I replied, drawing on decades of experience comforting grieving families during my years as a church volunteer. "Bradley would be so proud of how strong you're being during this terrible time. You're exactly the kind of wife he always hoped to find." Crystal's eyes brightened with what I recognized as relief that her deception remained intact. "Thank you for saying that. I've been so worried that I might disappoint him even now. He always said you had such good judgment about people and situations." The irony of that statement nearly broke my composure, but I maintained my role as the supportive mother-in-law who trusted Crystal's version of events completely. Tell me what decisions you're facing, dear. Maybe talking through the options will help clarify what Bradley would want. Crystal gestured toward the paperwork spread across the table, which I could now see included multiple copies of organ donation forms, life insurance claim documents, and what appeared to be funeral planning materials. The doctors say that Bradley's brain activity is minimal, and there's virtually no chance of meaningful recovery. They're recommending that we consider organ donation, which would allow his death to help save other lives. I nodded thoughtfully as if hearing this information for the first time. That does sound like something Bradley would support. He always believed in helping others whenever possible. Exactly, Crystal replied, her voice gaining confidence as she warmed to her subject. Dr. Phillips from the night shift explained that if we authorize organ donation tonight, the surgical team could begin harvesting procedures first thing in the morning. That would minimize the time Bradley spends on life support and allow his organs to be transplanted while they're still viable for helping other patients. Dr. Phillips. The name matched one of the physicians that Sarah had identified as being targeted by Crystal's bribery scheme. Crystal had clearly succeeded in corrupting the night shift staff to expedite procedures that would normally take much longer to authorize. Have you had time to contact Bradley's insurance company? I asked, playing the role of practical family member concerned about financial arrangements. I know he was always responsible about maintaining good coverage. Crystal's expression became appropriately solemn. Yes, I spoke with them this afternoon. Bradley's life insurance policy will provide $2 million in benefits, which should be enough to handle funeral expenses and help me maintain our home while I decide what to do with my future. $2 million mentioned so casually, as if it were simply a practical consideration rather than the primary motive for my son's murder. I forced my voice to remain steady and supportive. Bradley was always thoughtful about protecting the people he loved. I'm glad he made sure you'd be financially secure. He was such a good provider. Crystal agreed, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I just wish we'd had more time together. We were just starting to talk seriously about having children, and now that dream will never be realized. The mention of children that Crystal had never actually wanted made my stomach turn, but I maintained my sympathetic expression. Perhaps someday you'll find love again, dear. A wonderful woman like you deserves happiness even after such a terrible tragedy. Crystal's face brightened slightly, as if she were genuinely touched by my blessing for her future romantic endeavors. Of course, she already had Derek waiting in the wings, ready to help her spend Bradley's insurance money on their new life in Costa Rica. Evangeline, there's something else I need to discuss with you, Crystal said, her tone becoming more serious. The doctors found a note in Bradley's desk at home, and I think it explains why the accident happened. She produced the forged suicide note that I'd seen her show to Dr. Martinez earlier in the day. Up close, I could see that while the handwriting resembled Bradley's style, the letter formation was too careful and deliberate, lacking the natural flow of his usual quick penmanship. I can't believe Bradley was suffering so much without telling me, Crystal continued, her voice breaking with apparent anguish. He must have felt like such a failure as a husband, worrying that he couldn't provide the lifestyle I deserved. If only I'd realized how much pressure he was putting on himself. The suicide note blamed Bradley's supposed depression on financial stress and fear that he was disappointing his wife with his modest income. It painted a picture of a man who felt inadequate and hopeless, driven to desperate measures by shame and self-doubt. This doesn't sound like the Bradley I raised, I said, carefully, genuinely examining the document as if I'd never seen it before. He was always so optimistic about the future, so confident in his ability to overcome challenges. I think that's exactly why he hid his struggles from both of us, Crystal replied smoothly. Men often feel like they need to be strong for the women in their lives, even when they're falling apart inside. Bradley probably thought he was protecting us by keeping his depression secret. The conversation was interrupted by Crystal's phone ringing. She glanced at the caller ID and smiled apologetically. "I'm sorry, this is Bradley's insurance agent calling back about some paperwork questions. Would you mind if I took this call?" "Of course, dear. Take all the time you need." Crystal stepped into the hallway for privacy, but I could hear her voice changing as she spoke to Derek instead of any insurance representative. "Yes, everything is proceeding according to schedule. The old lady is being completely supportive, and Dr. Phillips confirmed that we can begin the donation process at 6 a.m. I'll meet you in the parking garage at midnight as planned." When Crystal returned, her grieving widow performance resumed flawlessly. The insurance company has been wonderfully compassionate about expediting Bradley's claim processing. They understand that losing a spouse creates immediate financial pressures that need to be addressed quickly. I nodded sympathetically. It's good to know that Bradley's careful planning will provide some stability during such a difficult time. He always worried about making sure you'd be taken care of if anything happened to him. "He was the most thoughtful man I've ever known," Crystal said, producing fresh tears on cue. "I just wish I could tell him one more time how much I loved him and how grateful I am for everything he did for our future." The words made me want to scream, knowing that Crystal's idea of gratitude involved slowly poisoning Bradley while planning his murder. But I maintained my supportive smile and offered the comfort that any caring mother-in-law would provide. "Bradley knows how much you loved him dear. That love will always be part of who he was, and it will help comfort you through the grieving process ahead." Crystal squeezed my hand with apparent genuine emotion. "Thank you for being so understanding about all of this. I was afraid you might blame me for not recognizing the signs of Bradley's depression, or think that I should have done more to prevent him from reaching such a desperate state of mind." "Nonsense," I replied firmly. "Depression is a disease that affects people's thinking in ways that their loved ones often can't predict or control. You were a wonderful wife to Bradley, and he was lucky to have someone who cared about him as deeply as you do." The validation seemed to relax Crystal's remaining tension about my potential suspicions. She began discussing practical arrangements with the confidence of someone who believed her deception had succeeded completely. "I've been thinking about funeral arrangements," she said, consulting notes on her laptop screen. "Bradley always preferred simplicity, so I'm planning a small graveside service followed by cremation. I think that would honor his memory while keeping costs reasonable." Cremation, of course, would destroy any remaining evidence of the antifreeze poisoning that had weakened Bradley before the accident. Crystal's attention to such details demonstrated the thoroughness of her planning and the coldness with which she calculated every aspect of her husband's murder. As midnight approached, Crystal began gathering her paperwork and preparing to leave the consultation room. "Evangeline, would you mind staying with Bradley for a while? I need to step outside for some fresh air and make a few more phone calls to family members who should be notified about his condition." "Of course, dear. Take all the time you need. I'll sit with Bradley and keep him company." Crystal paused at the door, looking back with what appeared to be genuine gratitude. "You've been such a blessing today, Evangeline. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without your support and understanding." As Crystal disappeared down the hallway toward her midnight meeting with Derek, I realized that my performance had been successful beyond my hopes. Not only had I convinced her that I remained completely naive about her crimes, but I'd also gathered additional evidence of her deception while she relaxed her guard around someone she believed posed no threat to her plans. In less than 30 minutes, Crystal would walk into the trap that would expose her entire criminal network and save Bradley's life. The grieving mother she'd dismissed as harmless was about to become the instrument of her complete destruction. At exactly midnight, I positioned myself in the family consultation room with a clear view of the parking garage elevator where Crystal had arranged to meet Derek. Sarah and Pete maintained watch positions throughout the ICU, while Marcus coordinated with Detective Captain Rodriguez and 3 additional officers who'd taken concealed positions near the main hospital entrances. Crystal emerged from the elevator at 12:05 a.m., no longer bothering to maintain her grieving widow performance now that she believed herself unobserved. Her posture was confident and businesslike as she walked briskly toward a black pickup truck parked in the shadows near the far wall of the garage. Derek stepped out of the driver's seat, and I got my first look at the man who'd helped plan my son's murder. He was younger than Crystal by several years, with the lean build and calloused hands of someone accustomed to manual labor. His casual embrace with Crystal confirmed the intimate relationship that their text messages had revealed. "Baby, I've been worried about you all day," Derek said, his voice carrying clearly in the empty parking garage. "When you texted about the old lady asking questions, I thought maybe we should abort and try again somewhere else." Crystal shook her head dismissively. "She's completely clueless, Derek. Evangeline actually thanked me for being such a wonderful wife to her precious son. She has no idea that I've been poisoning Bradley for months, or that I cut his brake lines yesterday afternoon." The casual admission of attempted murder spoken aloud and recorded by the surveillance equipment that Pete had strategically positioned throughout the garage provided the final piece of evidence needed to secure Crystal's conviction on multiple felony charges. "The brain death paperwork is ready to be signed at 6 a.m., Crystal continued. "Dr. Phillips will authorize organ donation without the standard waiting period. Linda will rush the processing through the administrative system, and we'll have the official death certificate by noon tomorrow." Derek pulled a manila envelope from his truck and handed it to Crystal. "Here are the updated travel documents and the account information for the offshore transfers. Once the insurance money hits our domestic account, the automatic wire transfer will move everything to Grand Cayman within 24 hours. Crystal opened the envelope, revealing fake passports with her and Derek's photos, but different names. The sophisticated quality of the forgeries suggested access to professional document creation services, further evidence of the criminal network's extensive resources and experience. "What about the loose ends?" Derek asked, his tone becoming more serious. "Jimmy confirmed that his contact at the police impound lot will make the brake line evidence disappear, but what if the old lady starts asking more questions after the funeral?" Crystal's expression hardened with cold calculation. "I've been thinking about that problem. Evangeline is in her late 60s, lives alone, and has a history of heart problems since her husband died. It would be very unfortunate if grief over losing her son triggered a fatal cardiac event, especially if she accidentally took too many of her anxiety medications while struggling with depression. The threat against my life, spoken with the same casual tone she'd used to describe Bradley's murder, confirmed that Crystal viewed killing as a routine business solution to potential complications." Derek nodded approvingly, as if they were discussing mundane travel logistics rather than planning additional murders. "That's smart thinking, baby. A grieving mother's suicide would actually reinforce the story about Bradley's depression, making it less likely that anyone would investigate the circumstances of his accident." My blood ran cold as I realized Crystal had been planning my murder from the beginning, viewing me as a predictable obstacle that would need to be eliminated after Bradley's death. The fake concern and gratitude she'd shown during our conversation an hour earlier had been calculated manipulation designed to position me as her next victim. But Crystal made a crucial error that provided the opening I needed to spring our trap. She pulled out her regular cell phone to show Derek photos of the forged power of attorney documents she planned to use with Dr. Phillips. "Look at how perfect Bradley's signature came out," she said proudly. I've been practicing it for months, and even his mother wouldn't be able to tell the difference. The phone's screen was clearly visible in the surveillance footage, providing visual evidence of the forged documents that would constitute additional felony charges of fraud and identity theft. More importantly, Crystal was so focused on impressing Derek with her criminal skills that she failed to notice the subtle movement of shadows near the garage entrance. Crystal, we need to talk about the timeline for eliminating Bradley's mother, Derek said, checking his watch. If we're going to make it look like natural causes, we need to act while she's still emotionally vulnerable from losing her son. I've already researched her medication schedule, Crystal replied matter-of-factly. Evangeline takes blood pressure medication and anxiety pills that would interact fatally with the same antifreeze compound I used on Bradley. A small amount in her coffee tomorrow morning would cause a heart attack within 6 hours, and the coroner would attribute it to grief and stress. The clinical precision with which Crystal planned my murder demonstrated that she'd studied my daily routines just as thoroughly as she'd studied Bradley's, treating potential victims as research subjects rather than human beings. Detective Captain Rodriguez stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, his service weapon drawn and badge clearly visible. Crystal Patterson and Derek Sullivan, you're both under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, insurance fraud, and tampering with evidence. Crystal's confident expression transformed instantly into wide-eyed panic as she realized the scope of the trap that had been set for her. What are you talking about? I don't understand what's happening here. My husband was in a car accident and I'm trying to make arrangements for his medical care. But Derek made the mistake of attempting to flee, confirming his guilt, while providing additional evidence of the conspiracy. He sprinted toward his truck while reaching for what appeared to be a weapon, forcing the waiting officers to tackle him to the ground before he could escape or endanger hospital staff. Derek Sullivan, you're under arrest, Captain Rodriguez announced, as additional officers secured the suspect. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Crystal began screaming denials and accusations, claiming that she was being framed and that Derek was a stranger who'd approached her in the parking garage. But her protests were undermined by the overwhelming evidence that had been systematically documented throughout the day. Mrs. Patterson, Captain Rodriguez said formally, "You're being arrested for the attempted murder of Bradley Patterson through mechanical sabotage and poisoning, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud in the inducement, and conspiracy to commit the murder of Evangeline Patterson." The mention of charges related to my planned murder seemed to shock Crystal more than anything else. That's impossible. Evangeline and I had a wonderful conversation tonight. I would never hurt my husband's mother. She's been incredibly supportive during this difficult time. Captain Rodriguez held up Crystal's burner phone, which contained all the text message conversations with Derek and evidence of their criminal network. Mrs. Patterson, we have recorded conversations from this evening in which you explicitly discussed plans to murder your mother-in-law using the same antifreeze poisoning method you used on your husband. As the officers secured Crystal in handcuffs, she made one final attempt to maintain her innocent victim performance. "Please, you have to believe me. I love my husband more than anything in the world. I would never hurt Bradley or anyone in his family. This is all a terrible misunderstanding." But Derek, apparently realizing that their situation was hopeless, began providing information that implicated Crystal in additional crimes. "Officers, this woman has been planning her husband's murder for months. I have evidence on my phone showing that she's killed other men using the same methods. She promised me $50,000 to help with the brake line sabotage." Crystal's mask finally slipped completely as she realized Derek was betraying her to save himself. "Shut up, you idiot! Don't say anything else until we have lawyers present." But the damage was done. Derek's admission provided confirmation of the conspiracy, and his willingness to testify against Crystal would ensure that both of them faced maximum prison sentences for their crimes. As the officers led Crystal away from the parking garage, she spotted me watching from the consultation room window. For just a moment, her expression revealed the cold-blooded killer behind the grieving widow facade, and she mouthed words that I couldn't hear but didn't need to understand. Crystal had discovered that the naive, trusting mother-in-law she'd planned to murder was actually the architect of her complete downfall. The woman she'd dismissed as harmless had systematically gathered evidence coordinated with law enforcement and set the trap that would ensure she spent the rest of her life in prison. But our victory was incomplete as long as Bradley remained unconscious and fighting for his life. The most important battle still lay ahead, ensuring that my son survived the poisoning and injuries that Crystal had inflicted on him and helping him rebuild his life after the devastating betrayal of the woman he'd trusted with his future. The first rays of dawn were streaming through the ICU windows when Dr. Martinez found me sitting beside Bradley's bed, holding his hand while monitoring the steady rhythm of his breathing. 18 hours had passed since Crystal's arrest, and my son's condition had begun showing encouraging signs of improvement as the antifreeze poison gradually cleared from his system. "Mrs. Patterson," Dr. Martinez said gently, "I wanted to update you on Bradley's progress and discuss the treatment plan moving forward. The good news is that his neurological responses have improved significantly since we began the chelation therapy to counteract the ethylene glycol poisoning." Chelation therapy. The medical term sounded like a miracle after the nightmare of the previous day. "What does that mean for his recovery prospects, Doctor?" "Bradley's brain activity has increased substantially over the past 12 hours. Dr. Martinez explained, consulting his tablet computer. "The traumatic brain injury from the accident was less severe than we initially feared, and most of the apparent brain damage was actually caused by the chronic poisoning rather than physical trauma." The relief that flooded through me was so overwhelming that I had to grip the bedside rail to keep from collapsing. Bradley wasn't brain dead or permanently damaged. Crystal's months of systematic poisoning had created symptoms that mimicked severe brain injury, but the damage was largely reversible with proper treatment. "How long before he regains consciousness?" I asked, stroking Bradley's hair the way I'd done when he was a child recovering from childhood illnesses. "Every patient responds differently to treatment, but based on his current progress, I'd expect Bradley to begin waking up within the next 24 to 48 hours. His youth and overall health before the poisoning began are working in his favor." Dr. Martinez paused, his expression becoming more serious. "Mrs. Patterson, I owe you an apology. If you hadn't discovered evidence of the poisoning and brought it to our attention, we would have continued treating Bradley for traumatic brain injury alone. The antifreeze poisoning might have been fatal within another day or two." The acknowledgement of how close Crystal had come to succeeding in her murder plot sent chills down my spine. If Sarah hadn't overheard Crystal's suspicious phone conversations, if I hadn't found the burner phone with incriminating text messages, if we hadn't gathered evidence quickly enough to prevent Crystal from authorizing organ donation, Bradley would have died without anyone realizing he'd been murdered. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face bright with genuine happiness for the first time since I'd met her during yesterday's crisis. "Mrs. Patterson, I wanted to check on Bradley's progress and let you know that the hospital administration has launched a full investigation into the staff members who were involved in your daughter-in-law's scheme. The investigation had revealed the extent of Crystal's corruption within the hospital system. Linda, the night shift supervisor, had been arrested for accepting bribes to circumvent medical safety protocols. Dr. Phillips faced criminal charges for agreeing to falsify brain death determinations in exchange for payment. 2 additional staff members were under investigation for providing Crystal with confidential medical information that helped her plan Bradley's murder. The hospital is implementing new security protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future, Sarah continued. All organ donation authorizations will now require verification from multiple independent physicians, and power of attorney documents will be subject to enhanced scrutiny before life and death medical decisions can be made. The systemic changes provided some comfort, knowing that Crystal's crimes might prevent similar tragedies from affecting other families. But the personal cost of her deception remained devastating, even with Bradley's improving prognosis. Marcus arrived with Captain Rodriguez, both men wearing expressions of grim satisfaction as they provided updates on the criminal investigation. Evangeline, I wanted you to know that Crystal and Derek have both been formally charged with multiple felonies, and the district attorney is confident that the evidence will support life sentences without possibility of parole. The additional charges had mounted as investigators uncovered the full scope of Crystal's criminal network. Beyond the attempted murder of Bradley and conspiracy to kill me, she faced counts of insurance fraud, document forgery, bribery of public officials, and money laundering related to her offshore banking arrangements. Derek has been providing information about Crystal's previous marriages, Captain Rodriguez added. We've confirmed that she was married twice before, and both of her previous husbands died under suspicious circumstances that were never properly investigated. Phoenix, Arizona, where Crystal had lived before moving to our state, and Reno, Nevada, where she'd resided before that. In both cities, middle-aged men with substantial life insurance policies had died in apparent accidents or from sudden illnesses that were now being re-examined as potential homicides. The insurance companies have frozen all of Crystal's accounts and are pursuing civil litigation to recover fraudulent claims from her previous marriages, Marcus explained. She won't see a penny of Bradley's insurance money, and she'll likely face additional federal charges related to the interstate nature of her crimes. The financial consequences provided additional satisfaction, knowing that Crystal would not profit from her attempted murder of Bradley, even if she somehow avoided conviction on criminal charges. The insurance industry's aggressive pursuit of fraud recovery would ensure that she remained bankrupt for the rest of her life. But the most important development came 3 days later, when Bradley's eyes fluttered open for the first time since the accident. I was dozing in the bedside chair when I heard him whisper my name, his voice weak but unmistakably conscious and coherent. "Mom," Bradley croaked, his hand moving slightly to find mine. "What happened? Where am I?" The sound of my son's voice, confused but alive, broke through the emotional control I'd maintained throughout the crisis. Tears of relief streamed down my face as I squeezed his hand and pressed the call button to summon medical staff. "You're in the hospital, sweetheart. You were in a car accident, but you're going to be okay. Everything is going to be okay now." Over the next several days, as Bradley regained strength and mental clarity, I had the heartbreaking task of explaining Crystal's betrayal and the systematic nature of her attempt to murder him. The revelation that his wife had been slowly poisoning him while planning his death was devastating for Bradley to process. "I thought she loved me," Bradley said quietly during one of our conversations. "I gave her everything I had, Mom. I changed my entire life to make her happy, and she was planning to kill me for money." The pain in his voice reminded me of the bewildered child he'd been when his father died, unexpectedly struggling to understand how life could be so unfair and unpredictable. But Bradley was stronger now, tempered by the experience of surviving deliberate evil rather than random tragedy. "Son, what Crystal did to you wasn't about who you are or how much you deserved love," I explained gently. "She's a predator who targets good men specifically because their trust and generosity make them vulnerable to manipulation. You were chosen as a victim because of your best qualities, not your worst ones. The criminal trial became a media sensation with national news coverage of the Black Widow nurse who'd murdered multiple husbands using medical knowledge gained from her healthcare background. Crystal's attempt to portray herself as a grieving victim was undermined by overwhelming evidence of premeditation and the cold-blooded nature of her crimes. Derek testified against Crystal in exchange for a reduced sentence of 25 years in prison, providing detailed information about their conspiracy and Crystal's previous murders. His testimony revealed that Crystal had been operating her marriage fraud scheme for over 5 years, targeting financially stable men in different states to avoid detection by law enforcement. Jimmy and Rick, the accomplices mentioned in Crystal's text messages, were arrested in separate states and charged with conspiracy and accessory charges related to multiple murders. The criminal network had been far more extensive than anyone initially suspected, involving corrupt officials in several states and sophisticated money laundering operations. Crystal was ultimately convicted on 17 separate felony counts and sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. The judge specifically noted the exceptional cruelty and calculation involved in slowly poisoning a spouse while maintaining an appearance of loving devotion. "Mrs. Patterson," the judge said during sentencing, "your crimes represent a betrayal of the most fundamental human bonds of trust and love. You exploited your husband's affection to gain access to his resources, then systematically murdered him while he trusted you to care for his well-being. Society requires that you spend the remainder of your life in prison to prevent further harm to innocent victims." The financial restitution ordered by the court exceeded $8 million, representing the total value of insurance claims from Crystal's 3 marriages, plus punitive damages for pain and suffering. Since Crystal had no assets remaining after legal fees and frozen accounts, the judgment served primarily as a symbolic recognition of the harm she'd caused, rather than practical compensation for her victims. Bradley made a complete physical recovery within 6 months, with no permanent neurological damage from either the accident or the antifreeze poisoning. But the emotional healing took much longer, requiring extensive therapy to process the trauma of discovering that his wife had been systematically betraying and poisoning him. "The hardest part," Bradley told me during one of our regular Tuesday dinners that we'd resumed, "is learning to trust my own judgment about people again. Crystal fooled me so completely that I question every relationship now." Eventually, Bradley did find love again with a nurse named Amanda who worked in the pediatric ward at Methodist General. Amanda had grown up on a farm in rural Kansas, valued honesty and family bonds above material possessions, and treated me with genuine respect rather than calculated manipulation. Their relationship developed slowly and naturally, with Amanda encouraging Bradley to maintain close family ties and including me in their social activities. When they married 2 years after Crystal's conviction, Amanda insisted that the ceremony be held in the backyard of my home, surrounded by the people who'd supported Bradley through his recovery. Sarah became like a second daughter to me, joining our family for holidays and celebrations, while pursuing advanced nursing education with financial support from the hospital's Victim Assistance Program. Her courage in recognizing Crystal's suspicious behavior and risking her job to warn me had prevented a murder and exposed a criminal network that had operated undetected for years. The victim advocacy group I established with help from the district attorney's office provided support for other families affected by marriage fraud and domestic violence. The organization focused on educating people about warning signs of predatory relationships and providing resources for survivors of systematic abuse. Trust your instincts about people even when everyone else thinks you're being paranoid, became the central message of our educational programs. Loving someone doesn't mean ignoring evidence that something is wrong. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone you love is refusing to stay silent when their safety is threatened. The experience taught me that evil often disguises itself in familiar faces and uses our deepest affections against us. Crystal had studied Bradley's relationship with me, carefully identifying my protective instincts as a potential obstacle that needed to be managed through manipulation and eventual elimination. But she'd underestimated the power of a mother's love combined with determination to seek truth regardless of personal cost. The grief and shock that she'd expected to paralyze me had instead transformed into focused energy that exposed her crimes and saved my son's life. 5 years later, as I watched Bradley playing in my backyard with his and Amanda's twin daughters, I reflected on how close we'd come to losing everything to Crystal's calculated greed. The children bore no resemblance to their father's first wife, but they carried his gentle nature and his commitment to treating others with kindness and respect. Sometimes the people who try to destroy us actually make us stronger, I told Sarah during one of her regular visits. Crystal thought she could eliminate everyone who might threaten her plans, but her cruelty brought together the community that ultimately defeated her. The most important lesson emerged from recognizing that family bonds, when tested by genuine crisis, can overcome even the most sophisticated deception. Bradley and I had allowed Crystal's manipulation to create distance between us, but the threat to his life had reminded us that our relationship was more important than any temporary misunderstanding or external pressure. Never let anyone convince you that family loyalty is weakness, I would tell audiences at victim advocacy events. The people who love you unconditionally are often your best protection against those who would exploit your trust for personal gain. As I finish telling you this story, I want to ask you something important. Have you ever felt like something was wrong in a relationship, but ignored those feelings because you didn't want to seem paranoid or judgmental? Trust those instincts. They might save your life or the life of someone you love. If this story touched your heart or opened your eyes to warning signs you hadn't considered before, please take a moment to share it with others who might benefit from hearing Bradley's story. Like this video to help it reach more people who need to understand the dangers of predatory relationships. Subscribe to hear more stories about survival justice and the power of family bonds to overcome even the darkest betrayals. Thank you for listening to my story and for caring enough about the safety of others to help spread awareness about these important issues. I hope that sharing our experience will help protect other families from the kind of devastation that Crystal tried to bring into our lives. Remember, when someone you love is in danger, being called paranoid is a small price to pay for being right. Trust your instincts, gather your evidence, and never stop fighting for the people who matter most to you. May you always have the courage to speak up when something feels wrong, and may your family bonds prove stronger than any force that tries to tear them apart.